of contemporary history in Austria. Quite a new museum. It opened just 6 months ago, in November 2018. For the first time, because it's the first official museum in Austria that deals with the 20th century and with democracy, the development of democracy. Also including the time when Austria was not a democracy. So that's the main point, one of the main focuses of the museum and the starting exhibition of the house. It's at the whole exhibition and the house is at a very important place in Austria. It includes the Heldenblatt, which is really the main place in Austria for some reasons, because then you have the historical focus on the 20th century in Austria, because there you can see the past of the monarchy, still very present, but also the past that deals with Austria being dictatorship during the 1930s and the Nazi past. And so it's all concentrated here, and the main point, of course, is the famous balcony where Adolf Hitler announced the annexation, the Anschluss in 1938. So that's also part of the museum, and to include it into the narrative of the museum and to see what Austria is dealing when talking about democracy, the balcony is one of the really prominent places here. Behind me there is the opening exhibition. It deals with 100 years of Austria being a republic and being a democracy, because on 12th of November 1918, after the end of the First World War and after the collapse of the monarchy, Austria became a republic for the first time and a democracy. And so the opening exhibition is really dealing with these 100 years and all the problems, all the narratives that were developed during these 100 years. What we have here is the first room. The first room is dealing with the year 1918 and with major questions. And so I'm really focusing on the Nazi system now and the time shortly afterwards. But there is one major question also raising in 1918, because the nation that was born in 1918 named itself German Austria, so Deutsch Österreich, which means that they define themselves as being part of Germany. They find themselves over the language, the German language. It was a problem for Austria, but what you can see here is, in fact, coming out of an economical crisis, that Austria from the beginning on was very close to Germany, and that of course led to the annexation in 1938, in fact. But the key points, and also talking about the political parties in Austria in the First Republic, the key is really in the year 1918. So you can see from the posters of the political parties that the German nationalists were quite strong, in fact. And the idea of an annexation was also quite a big one. What you can see is what was created in 1918 was kind of the first victims myth. So the big monarchy was destroyed, and what was left was Austria, so a small nation, in fact, that defined itself by language. And the victims myth that was created was much stronger in Germany, of course, but there was a victims myth also in Austria after the end of the First World War, saying, as you know, the Austrian monarchy didn't lose the war at the battlefields because of political reasons. And that was also, of course, the main explanation of the National Socialists in 1938. So that's something that the Austrian society kind of embraced, and also all the political parties, more or less. So here you can see really that were the roots of all the questions during the 1930s and then the 1940s, of course.
Yeah, that was one of the main agendas of the National Socialist Party in Germany. That the First World War wasn't lost, but it was it was lost by politicians, right?
Yeah.
So the same narrative also took root in Austria.
On a different level, it was not so much regarding the war itself. It was much more regarding the collapse of the monarchy, because what was once a very big empire was now a small nation. And so the Austrians, and what was coming out of this monarchy was, they weren't sure if they were able to survive, saying, okay, we are the losers of the war, and now you can see how they hate us, because they are destroying everything. So that was the victim's myth in 1918. It was much more regarding the destruction of the monarchy, not so much regarding the war. So that's the difference to Austria.
Yeah, and what about the shift from one multinational empire, right, as Austro-Hungarian empire was, into National Socialism, into racism and
yeah, you have the roots. You can see the roots also in 1918, of course, because the collapse of the monarchy, in fact, was problems between the nations of the empire, in fact. And what was coming out of that was a strong German nationalism, in fact. So the Germans defined themselves as the leading nation within the empire. And with the end of the empire, that doesn't end. So still, Austria feels as a German nation being threatened by all the nations around. That was once the monarchy. So threatened by the Czech, threatened by the Hungarians, by the Slovenes, the Yugoslavians, the Serbs, and so on. So then this is where the roots of German and nationalism you can see within the parties, because you have several German nationalistic parties in Austria. And that, of course, led to National Socialism and to a very, very strong view to Germany, feeling themselves being near to Germany, being part of Germany during decades. Yeah.
So you actually left out the First World War. The First World War is not present, though in many other catalogization or for many other nations, Europe is actually in a certain way reflected from the 1914 on.
Yeah, no, that's also part of the story of Austria, of course. But Austria has a very specific situation in 1918, because not only losing the war, but having really lost the whole empire. That was the feeling of the people. And that's something we are telling here at the exhibition, saying that the people had no idea what they went through and what was coming next. What democracy is, of course, but also what is Austria. The people didn't feel as Austrians, they felt as Germans in Austria. So that's the starting point of the exhibition. What we're trying to do is say the background is First World War and monarchy, definitely. That's the big catastrophe of the 20th century, of course, that led to several developments. In fact, also led to the construction of the National Socialistic Party, of course, coming out of German nationalism. But there are several other levels regarding the Austrian situation, because what you have to see is that Austria lost big parts of the former economy within the empire. That was one very, very big point. So Austria really started with a big economical crisis where we were not able to handle. So that's the next point.
And what is with the attentat? It was in Sarajevo, for example. For us, interesting for our research, because we have also ex-Yugoslavia or the Balkan territory. This is not part, or it's just...
No, it's just as the background. Here at the exhibition, we are starting really with 1918 because of 100 years of Austria being a republic. So that's the main focus of the exhibition, which is of course not the focus of the whole house of Austrian history. Then it's a big point, of course, in several reasons, because Austria has historical connection lines to Serbia, to Slovenia, to Croatia, and so on, of course. And especially the attentat in 1914 is also a big point of Austrians' victims myth and hatred against Serbia, for example, and strong feelings that are still here more or less on several occasions, and especially during the Second World War, because very much Austrians were within the Waffen-SS that were stationed at the Balkan. This is the map. It's the year 1918. It's of course not a discussion about colonies, because the Austrian Empire had no colonies. As you can probably see, and that's the meaning, and also my opinion of several historians, is that the Austrian colony was more or less the Balkan. So that's especially Bosnia. that was the point of view of Austria, and the Austrian emperor more or less declared the right to colonize the Balkan, and of course it led to conflict with Serbia.
And it was the reason, just to clarify, because this was the only part of the cake that was left.
Yeah, that's right. It was the only part that was left, and the only part where no other Western nation had any influence, more or less. So the only nations that were there and were trying to get influence and had influence was Serbia and of course Russia, traditionally. That led into the conflict of the First World War, of course. So that was the reason why Russia was on the other side. It was the reason why Serbia was on the other side, traditionally, because of war and as they were fleeing war and so on. So you have quite a large Jewish population in Vienna at the end, which led, and when the economical crisis was coming, and political parties were using the Jews to create to strengthen anti-Semitism, which was already there, of course, to strengthen it, saying that the Eastern Jews are the big threat to Austria, to the new republic, and they are the reason why the economy is so weak. That was the main explanation of political parties, especially of the right wing and the German nationalist parties since 1918, led to strong feelings against. They really that was the name for them was the Eastern Jews. They were poor, coming from a very poor region, and they had not very much living in parts of Vienna, and they were really kind of an image of an enemy that was created by the big German nationalistic parties in Austria. So anti-Semitism was also a point. It was there already during the monarchy, but not that strong, because the emperor was more or less the protection shield over the Jewish population and the other nations within the monarchy. So there's a chronological section here, right on the right side, with telling the story of Austria in decades. It's a discussion about pictures. So you have a discussion about a specific decade with the pictures of that decade. That's one point. The other point is a thematical topics. What you can see here is, like this one, it's the topic called economy and one of economy. It's really focused on 100 years of Austria, seeing it from an economical point of view. What you can see here is just pick one section over here, the economical crisis in the 30s, because that's quite important if you talk about anti-Semitism and the role Austria played regarding a coming dictatorship and National Socialism, of course. So what you can see here is Austria was coming out of a big economical crisis after the end of war. It's something you can see here. The second part is here. The beginning was, in fact, a big world economical crisis in 1929. In Austria was hit very hardly by the economical crisis. 2 years later, in 1931, one of the biggest bank in Austria collapsed, and the Austrian government was trying to rescue the bank. They were not able to do it. So what Austria did was, and the Austrian government is, they asked the so-called Völkerbund, so the international organizations of several nations, for help, for financial help. They said yes. They wanted to help Austria, but only under the strict points. Saying the first point is Austria is not allowed to be part of Germany. So the Anschluss that came later was forbidden for several times in Saint-Germain already during the 1920s and again in 1932. It was of course also a political question. What Austria did is they got the money, but they had to pay back, and they kind of destroyed the social system in Austria. So what was coming out of the situation was the Austrian economy kind of developed, was coming out of the crisis, but the situation of the people, the living situation was going bad, really going bad. So we have 50% were unemployed in bigger cities in Austria. And that was something that the political parties, and especially the very young National Socialistic Party, were using. Saying, okay, there are some reasons why Austria has such big economical problems. Two reasons. The first one is because of the Jews. It was the first point. As you can imagine, it was for the National Socialism, the Nazis, there was the main narration was, okay, that's the financial system is collapsing, and as you know, the financial system is under the control of the Jews. That kind of anti-Semitism was quite strong, and you can find it within every party in Austria, even the communists, social democrats, the conservatives, and of course the Nazis, which at that point was a young party. Anti-Semitism was the first reaction. The second reaction was, and that was coming to Austrofascism, saying that the chancellor at this time, in 1932, was already Engelbert Dollfuss. And his explanation was not anti-Semitic. He was saying, okay, the big problems we have, especially the economical crisis, there you can see that democracy is too weak. What we need is a strong man that is able to solve all our problems. And 2 years later, Austria was not a democracy anymore. So he was using the crisis to explain that democracy is too weak and that we need a dictatorship. You can see it at the newspapers over here. Is a dictatorship coming was one of the headlines of Austrian newspapers in 1932. And that was kind of, it was fashionable in fact, because you can see the development in all the European countries becoming, almost all European countries, and especially in mid-Europe, were destroying democracy and were kind of erecting a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship. And Austria was the same. As you can see, they had a strong point of view. The view was going in the direction of Germany, and they were seeing that Germany was kind of getting bigger and bigger, a strong economy, and the people becoming wealthier, and so on, and not in Austria. So again, there was the strong call for a strong man, but also a call for a fascist system.
In these newspapers, Arbeiter Zeitung, where were they ideologically?
One can think that the worker newspaper was Social Democrat. In fact, that's an exception, because this is Christian socialism, which means the conservatives. But of course, that was the main point of the Social Democrats, saying it was a question of law, because there was an exception law in Austria coming from the war, saying that in an economical crisis you can use an exceptional law to kind of overgo the parliament and the Nationalrat and so on. And it was something that the political party and especially the conservatives were using, saying, okay, we don't need a parliament, there's no need for it because we have the strong man. And that's of course dictatorship, and that's why it was the headline, especially of the Social Democrats, because they were the enemies, in fact. We are trying to connect, because what you can see is kind of a window over here, and if you go on the other side, then you can see that this is a back of the European Union, the situation in Greece. So the too big to fail is the connection to the economical crisis of today, and how political parties are reacting to it.
I will expect to see actually also the story of the refugees then.
Yeah, there's a large section over here regarding borders and regarding refugees, and especially the outer borders of the European Union. It's an own section over here. It's not here regarding economy, but in the other section we have this discussion.
What is the division? That you talk about Austrian dictatorship and then it's the Nazi period.
Yeah. What we are talking is really, the point is the remembrance. So how are both regimes remembered in Austria, and what are the big discussion points? The main discussion point is that Austria, being in a fascist dictatorship, is kind of forgotten, and for quite a long time not discussed. and the responsibility Austria had and what the nation they created during 1933 and 1938 and how it led into Nazi dictatorship, that's something that was not discussed in Austria for quite a long time. What you can see here, that's something just behind the horse. You can see it perfectly, even in the preparation for the exhibition, because large points, large groups here, Beirat of the Austrian House of History, were not able to find a term for that time, that specifically Austrian. It's not clear if you can call it Austrofascism or Ständestaat, if you can call it dictatorship of the government, or if you should use another term. There is no consensus about that, and that's still a political discussion. Whereas regarding the Nazi system, there we have other points which are still discussed. The main point is still the responsibility of Austria and perpetrators. So that's still a main point. Shifted a little bit over the last decades, because at first it was a question of victims. Now you have more or less the questions of perpetrators and responsibility. So still you can see it here regarding Austrofascism. Just one point I wanted to express, seeing what is the big problem in Austria, is that the system, the Dollfuss-Schuschnigg regime, fought against Nazis in Austria and against Adolf Hitler, which led to the point of view that Engelbert Dollfuss was the first resistance fighter, and that's still a narration that is present until today, especially within the very, very conservative parts of Austria. The other point of view is regarding a civil war in February fightings in 1934, is that the Schuschnigg-Dollfuss regime fought against communists and social democrats. So that would be the other narration. Both narration didn't match for quite a long time. And that's the reason why there are still political discussions.
What are the consequences about these discussions today? It's any really open question politically that we can see filling the space and that is actually coming out because this was not clear historically?
There are some things that you can still feel today. One point, for example, is Austria having a conscription within the Austrian army. There's still a narration going back to the Civil War, when the Austrian army fought against the own population. And Austria would need conscription, because then there is no chance for a government or one political party to have control over the Austrian army. And that's the reason why Austria still has a conscription. So that's just one point which you can feel today. The other point are political discussions. For example, still a picture of Engelbert Dollfuss was within the ÖVP. Under the new government, you can see that these kind of political discussions about the Austrian past was kind of ended for some reasons, which is not a good development, of course, because then you have no reflection, no discussion anymore, especially about, because what was the core of the political discussion was still that there was an Austrian dictatorship, and dictatorship does not mean National Socialism, but means there is an Austrian fascism. And this discussion at the moment is ended, with the exception of course, the historical science. One of the biggest key questions is the so-called Anschluss in 1938. Because for quite a long time, that was the core of Austria feeling as the first victim of National Socialism. Which means, that were the pictures you can see here, that the German army marched into Austria. It was a violent annexation. It was the first point of view. The other point, you can see especially here at the Heldenplatz, were 200,000 people cheering when Adolf Hitler announced the annexation of Austria. And so what you have in a scientific discussion, you have now a different point of view. It's an annexation of Austria coming from outside, coming from the inside, coming from above, but also coming from below. Yeah. So from different levels. The question we have here at the museum and within the exhibition is how Austrians embrace National Socialism. In which way, how, why. And what you can see here is that's really the discussion here. Seeing all the things like the swastikas that were almost everywhere in Austria, even before the Nazis were here. That's something you can see here, but the main point is violence against Jews. Immediately, even before the Nazis were here, so just before the Germans were here, sorry. So the Austrians react to the new situation, and this anti-Semitic violence broke out very, very soon.
And what would you say, how the proponents of the first victim narrative explain the enthusiasm by which Hitler was met in Austria?
That has something to do with the first victims myth going back to 1918. So saying that that's a very nationalistic point of view, of course. So the Austrians were feeling as Germans that all the nations within Europe were trying to destroy this large German nation. So what the Austrians were really feeling of being part of Germany, and now when Hitler is coming, now the strong feelings they have of having their own nation, their own German nations, were kind of
pan-Germanic unification, kind of.
Yeah, that's right. So that's something that was part of the victims myth, and for quite a long time it was the big narration saying they were not cheering for National Socialism but cheering for Germany. So that was the narration for really quite a long time, which is no explanation for anti-Semitic violence, of course. Because then you have the key point of the German victims, the Austrian victims myth is that you don't discuss this kind of violence. Because it's really National Socialistic. So you can see a board game called Choose Out. 1 million of these board games were sold in 1938 in Austria alone. So it's, yeah.
So you're saying that currently the anti-Semitic violence is not so often discussed in public space?
Or? It was not. There is a large shift since 1986, of course. Mm-hmm. But before, it wasn't really not discussed because it was against the official picture of Austria being a victim. What we can see here is really a discussion about National Socialistic terror. That's the museum's discussion, in fact, how to handle it. So how to show violence, extreme violence and Nazi terror. What we decided is not to show human bodies, which was usually for quite a long time, but to give the visitors an insight to specific persons, and they are telling the stories on a specific place. We've chosen 6 places in the whole German Reich that has a connection to Austria on several levels.
So what do you do with the concentration camps? Because Mauthausen has a lot of dislocated space all over Austria.
That's right. That's why Mauthausen is one of the places we're showing here. That's Mauthausen.
But it's pretty everything in a miniature. Is because it's so huge, the whole exhibition, because it's covered in 100 years?
Yeah, the reason is, yeah, that's right. That's regarding the exhibition. And what you have is the next space for an exhibition upstairs, and there you have the large discussion about Holocaust, concentration camps. So what we're trying to do is to talk about victims, perpetrators, and so on specific places and regarding concentration camps upstairs in connection with the balcony. So that's the main focus we have. So what we are doing here is really to shed some light on the fate of several people in different places, which means not only, well, the only people we are showing here are victims, But we have a discussion also about perpetrators. For example, as you can see here is Auschwitz. The architects of the gas chambers and the crematorium of Auschwitz were Austrians. We are not showing them, of course, because in this discussion the victims are in the center, of course, not the perpetrators. But we want to show this also when talking about the extermination of Jews, that the Austrians were part of the system. And also you have a discussion about law afterwards, because the architects were not sentenced after the end of war, because they were saying they had no idea when they planned the gas chamber what the gas chamber was used for.
They actually said that.
Yeah. And they were not punished because of that explanation.
So they returned to Austria?
Yeah, that's right. The first victims myth of Austria was being the first victim of National Socialism. That was the first myth. The second one has another function, had another function. We're telling the story that the Austrians were the victims of liberation and war. That is something that worked quite well for prisoners of war, for the returning people from war, former soldiers, and for former National Socialists. And the main point of that myth is air war, still until today, even in Germany and also in Austria. Because there is a big narration, and you have it on places of remembrance. Even in Vienna, in Germany, it would be Dresden, for example, where the people can talk about war and still strongly only feel as victims and not as perpetrators. It's kind of it has no connection to Holocaust. So that's interesting within the discussion of remembrance. And that's why we created a research project about air war, dealing with another phenomenon. What you can see here is the murder of downed Allied airmen, the so-called lynch justice. That's fairly new and still very emotionally discussed. The story behind that is that especially Joseph Goebbels found out and saw, of course, in 1943 that the German army was not able anymore to fight the bomber squadrons that were coming into Germany. And so what he was doing is to create another war, saying that bomb war is not a war, but it's a crime. And therefore the pilots and the airmen of the Allies are not soldiers but criminals. And they were really thinking about what can we do to involve the population. And in 1944 they were saying, okay, we create lynch justice. So whenever an airman is coming down to a parachute and groups of people were standing around the alien, then they are allowed to use violence. There was no order to do it, they were just allowed to do it. And in Austria alone, within 1 year, we found 100 places where an airman was murdered like this, in a really lynch justice, very brutal. And still, until today, there is hardly any commemoration, because it is linked with the air war and a strong sense of being a victim and not being a perpetrator. That's something that's quite actual at the moment. And emotionally discussed, in fact.
And this resistance?
That's resistance, yeah. So we're trying to show resistance fighters and to define resistance, in fact, but to show every group of resistance with discussing people, persons, women and men, which are not that famous, quite unknown more or less. So you can see Jewish resistance in a concentration camp. He helped in Auschwitz. Aaron Menche helped Jewish children on their way to the gas chamber, and he went into the gas chamber with them. Or military resistance on different levels. Communist resistance, conservative resistance, for example, partisans. It's a big point in Austria. Especially Slovenian partisans.
This is what I wanted to ask, because also in the Austrian state treaty, one of the possibilities not to actually to be liberated and not to have the same sort as Germany was precisely this, that it was proved that Austria was opposing the war, that was partisans fighting against. But we don't think again it is very small, it's just a glimpse.
It is a glimpse, but that's something we have decided to do, because what we don't want to create is the impression that Austria, in the whole Austria, was resisting against the Nazis. So that's of course, I know that's a very small way to go. We wanted to show people that resisted, that were using resistance, and who died for that. So all the people you can see here lost their lives. So they are also victims, and so that's our main point. But we don't want to create the impression that it was an Austrian resistance, that Austria fought against the Nazis, because that is not true. And so that's the main discussion. It's a very thin line, of course, talking about victims, resistance fighters, and perpetrators at the same time, and why you have the main focus on. But here we are saying, okay, victims and resistance fighters. But the main story we're telling is that there were people, individuals, who decided to do something against the system and who lost their lives, and they know that they were losing their life. Here we have the discussion within the Second Republic. The first part here is like the background of the whole historical debate is the question of liberation. In Austria, of course, the liberation at first was in 1945 when the Allies reached Austria. Second World War ended. The problem for Austria and for the Austrian political parties was that the Allies stayed in Austria, and that there were Soons, Russian, French, British and American Soons. So Austria, on the one hand, felt liberated, but on the other hand, was still occupied. And that was the main narration of the political parties, saying the main goal should be that Austria is free without any occupation zones. And so they shifted the term of liberation from the end of Second World War to the end of the occupation. And this became the main focus of the Austrian population and the Austrian parties, saying we want liberation. And they did not mean liberation from the Nazi system, but meaning the liberation from the Allies. Of course, having Cold War in mind, seeing what happened to Germany, and so on. It was a strategy, especially from the conservatives and the social democrats, of course, to rebuild Austria at first. But there was something coming out of that, something very strong, which you can see here. That's probably one of the most impressive objects we have here, although it doesn't look like that. That's a working copy of the Austrian State Treaty. And what you can see here is the negotiations from the Austrian delegation with the Allies, and especially with the Russians. As you can see at the cross marked at the USSR, about the Austrian State Treaty and what Austria should be in the future, 1955. And what you can see here are remarks from the Austrian Chancellor back then and Minister of the Exterior, Leopold Figl. He survived concentration camp, by the way, so conservative. What you can see is that he erased one sentence. That's the so-called guilty sentence, saying that Austria is responsible for Nazi system, is responsible for Nazi war crimes, and so on. And the Austrians were able, especially Leopold Figl, to erase it from within the State Treaty. So that what you can see here is the manifestation of the Austrians' myth being the first victim of National Socialism. And it was really, you even have the State Treaty where you have the manifestation of the myth.
It's unbelievable how soon it had taken root.
Yeah. But it was because of the statesmen in Austria. So that's also has something to do with Austrofascism too, because the big political parties were still there. So the conservatives and the social democrats who fought against each other in the 1930s. And of course the politicians were the same. So Leopold Figl was a member of the conservatives even in the 1930s and had the other social democrats opposing was also here. So what they were doing is trying to get a strategy and a tactic saying, okay, we have to rebuild Austria. We should not talk about Austrofascism because then you have the old war again, probably even the threat of a civil war. So don't talk about Austrofascism. Okay, but then we have to talk about the Nazi system, which was not good for them, of course. And so they had the strategy to say, okay, the best way is to say we are victims. Simple, only victims.
Would you say that the separation of the Holocaust from the main memorialization discourse you've mentioned before is connected with this sort of obfuscation of Austrian fascism?
Yeah, this has something to do with it. Yeah. But what you can see, it's again on several levels. That's the political level, what you can see here, but there is also a financial level behind it all, because it was for Austria, it was quite good to say we are the first victims, because then you don't have to define who are the victims, really the victims, and that's the discussion you can see here. Because at first, just to give you the impression, in 1946, Austria was defining victims of Nazi terror only if they were able to prove that they are Austrians, so they have an Austrian citizenship. People who were refugees in 1938 and 1939 had no citizenship, so Austria defined them not being victims of Nazi system. And the second point was they had to prove that they were fighting against National Socialism for Austria, which means it excluded the partisans, for example. It also included people who were taken to the concentration camps because they didn't fight for quite a long time. So Austria really built this myth, was trying to find an Austrian resistance. The problem, and it's something I had explained just before, there was no nationalistic resistance in Austria. It was a political one, it was a military one, it was especially a communist one, quite a large communist one, but there was no Austrian resistance. And so what Austria did is they created their own national resistance called O5, which means OI for Österreich for Austria. That's a construction, in fact. So that's what it was a group in the end of war, but it didn't work in the end. Because the main resistance groups were really political, but not national ones. So that's something that's really constructions after the end of war, saying Austria had a national resistance, which is not true.
Which were the most the political minds behind this? Exist very concrete names of politicians that can be enlisted.
Several. It was, of course, the main political parties, which means the ÖVP, the Conservatives, and the Social Democrats. Leopold Figl was one of them, for example, but you can name almost every Austrian politician in the 1950s, especially in the 1960s. They embraced the Austrian victims myth, really, for several reasons. It's interesting because, especially when talking about Leopold Figl was in several concentration camps, so he was really a victim of Nazi terror, but he said, being interviewed, that that's the only way for Austria, because otherwise we have to pay for the victims, otherwise Austria would be occupied for quite a long time, and probably the eastern part of Austria would have the same fate like the German Democratic Republic. So that was at first a strategy, but it worked quite well on several levels for Austria. One level was that they had not to define the victims for quite a long time. That's something you can see over here. Just to show you, it needed time. Several victims groups, for example, Slovenes, were declared as victims of Nazi terror in 1988, so quite a long time. Or homosexuals, for example, in 2005, so it really needed quite a long time. Or Roma, for example. That was coming out of the victims myth. There was another point. What I was saying, when I was saying just before, I was explaining, is that Austria felt as the first victim of National Socialism. This worked quite well on the outside. But on the inside, they had problems because former soldiers, returning prisoners, didn't have the feeling of being a victim of National Socialism. They still feel as soldiers and losing a war, of course, but not as victims of the Germans. And so Austria created the second victims myth, saying that the Austrians are victims of war and liberation. And you can see it all in almost every village in Austria, memorial stones for the fallen soldiers. Also including civilians that lost their lives during the bomb war. But what you don't see is not including, for example, Jews that were taken out of the villages. So only the civilians lost their lives in the bomb war and the soldiers that lost their lives in war. The main discussion points in the first years were the returnees, so the prisoners of war from the Soviet Union, of course. That was the main point, to get them back. The problem was, when they were back in Austria, you had a large group of former soldiers, a large group of former National Socialists, which were able to influence elections. And so all the political parties in Austria were trying to get their votes, and including former National Socialists into the party. The Social Democrats, also the Conservatives, the Communists were an exception. But a new party was built in 1949 called the Wahlpartei der Unabhängigen. It later was renamed in FPÖ. So that it's an interesting poster. What you can see here is we are asking for the Heimkehrer, so the returnees, and the so-called Neuwähler, so the new voters, which are the National Socialists. And you can see the posters almost everywhere. That this kind, the ÖVP is not saying it's not fair to exclude former Nazis from elections, because they are also Austrians. So that was the main point in 1949. So not only having a victims myth, but to officially include former Nazis into the political system in Austria and into society again. On the one hand, on the other hand, not define who are the victims. So that's the big problem with the victims myth. And then you can see that on this side, all the political discussions, main discussions in Austria, like this one, the Borodajkiewicz affair, for example, or the Kreisky-Peter-Wiesenthal affair of Simon Wiesenthal, which means that an Austrian chancellor, a social democrat, uses anti-Semitic words just to get more voters in Austria. And there were anti-Semitic words against Simon Wiesenthal, saying that he was a collaborator during Nazi system because that was the way how he survived the concentration camp. So
and this was said by
Kreisky.
Kreisky?
Yeah. Even he was also Jewish.
I know.
So that's something, we're just using it for political means. Knowing that was the large opinion of Austrians. Saying, okay, if you use anti-Semitic words, then you will win the elections probably. So that was something that Kreisky was also playing with. Yeah, the big point is of course here, and this horse. I think you know the story, and that was the turning point in Austria, yes. 1986, when the presidential candidate Kurt Waldheim, he was asked about his past during the Second World War, and the only thing he was saying was, "I only did my duty like hundreds of thousands Austrians." That's not very sensitive for a president. But he was also saying that when being asked if he played a role during Nazi time, he was saying, "No, I never was a member of any Nazi organization." And this book here proved that he was a member of the SA. And then the Austrian Chancellor back then, Genealogy, was saying, "Okay, we are recognizing probably that Kurt Waldheim was a member of the SA on this course." And that's why we have Kurt Waldheim was. And it changed Austria really. Because after 1986, we had, in Austria, there was a discussion about victims, there was a discussion of responsibility, and the main point is that since then there is a discussion about perpetrators. Adolf Eichmann, for example, a big discussion, or quite a young discussion, is Amon Good, but also women here. For example, Maria Mandl in Auschwitz was one of the perpetrators. Yeah, anti-Semitic violence within words is something you can find here. That's quite new. It's the so-called Germania Songbook. I don't know if you heard about it. That's the main political discussion with the FPÖ at the moment. It's a songbook. It was used by German fraternities, national fraternities in Wien Neustadt. And if you read in the lines, then you can see things like we were reaching the 7th million. Really strong anti-Semitic words, glorifying the SS and so on. The point was that high-ranking Austrian politicians were involved in that crisis from the FPÖ.
And this was published in 2018 and republished?
It was republished in 1993, but it was found out by a newspaper in 2018. Yeah. And that's one of the main discussions at the moment, saying, of course, have something to do with the FPÖ as a right-wing party within government, with that background. So that's the discussion at the moment, how anti-Semitic words are coming back at the moment, and where they are at the moment, and that they are also in government.
And these words are explicitly glorifying the
SS.
Holocaust.
Yeah.
In the SS.
Yeah. Yes, but what you can see is, and that's why it's so important to have the exhibition here, that you still have a victim's myth, and a new victim's myth within the FPÖ, and Strache is using a victim's myth by himself, saying that no matter what I was talking about, but I'm a victim, and that is working for some reasons, saying that all this discussion and debates about anti-Semitism was coming from the outside just to destroy the Austrian nation and the Austrian nationalistic parties. And that is really working. So that you can see it's a discussion between victims and perpetrators again, and about the victim's myth. You can see how it is working still. And it has influence on the Austrian view of Second World War again. Because after 1986, I told you that something changed in Austria, talking about victims, talking about perpetrators, and the victims myth was kind of destroyed. But at the moment it is coming back. You can see it on several levels. You can see it in memorials, for example, on several levels. The so-called Trümmerfrauen, which means the women that rebuilt Austria after the end of war. The researchers found out that the women that rebuilt Austria in several ways were mainly former National Socialistic women that were sentenced to build the destroyed buildings. But it changed during the decades, in fact, saying, okay, they were the ones that rebuilt Austria. And that's a very strong narration coming from the FPÖ at the moment, saying Austria was a victim of Second World War, and Austria by their own build up the country again, and still doing that, being threatened from the outside. So that's the narration at the moment, and it is working. It's winning elections.
Which factors are actually reproducing and all the time cementing all these myths?
It's a question of generation, I would say, because every generation is asking different questions, in fact. And we had generations in Germany and Austria that were not talking to them with them about this time. And so still you have, until now, you have a wartime generation that has their own point of view, of course. We're talking now to other generations that we're really asking them other questions, and especially questions about perpetrators and responsibility is a very young one. In fact, but it is seen by several people as threatening Austria and the Austrian society. And so I don't know if it's still, I don't think that's still national socialism that is here, but what National Socialism works with. So concept of an enemy, building the sense of a group, in fact it is threatened from the outside, and that's still very strong. It is working everywhere. So
and the others are usually defined as non-Europeans, non-white, non-Christian.
That's right.
Plus a couple of others.
That's right. That's right. So it's still having an inside and having an outside. That's something that you need if you create a concept of an enemy, and you can see it. The concept of an enemy since 2015 are refugees and the Islam, of course. So that's something that has nothing to do with National Socialism, for example, because there was no anti-Islamistic. National Socialism was not anti-Islamistic, it was anti-Semitic. That's new, in fact, but it's in the same way, I would say.
One of the questions, it was for us also very interesting, it is a very small section of the Gastarbeiter. While they were actually called, and in that Gastarbeiter was former ex-Yugoslavia, but also it was a Turkish minority that is it's the biggest minority in Austria still, and it's second and third generations, it's Austrians actually with now Turkish roots. So what was the negotiation regarding this point in your presentation of the story?
We have it on several points. We have it within economy because the so-called Gastarbeiter played a main role in the rebuilding of Austria. They were needed at this time and were praised and welcomed in Austria until Austria was rich. When it was rich, then they were the outsiders because they don't speak the language that well. And still a point, of course. It's the same discussion with the refugees, for example. So if we are talking about refugees during the 1950s, 1960s, there was the main refugee crisis in Austria, and the refugees were welcomed in Austria. But that's totally different than today, coming from totally other part of the world, of course. But that's still a main point in Austria, defining about language. About the German language, that's the same as in the 1920s and 1930s, and still creating the feeling of a threat, saying that all the people that are not talking German, for example, are building their own group and fighting against the German-speaking part of Austria. So that's still the sense that's here. Coming out of the monarchy, that's probably the point why it is so strong in Austria. Still, especially regarding former Yugoslavia, because during the monarchy they were really felt as a threat. As you probably know, the German language was the official language within the monarchy, and so the German parts of Austria were speaking German, of course, but no other language. And the not German-speaking parts in the monarchy were speaking their own language, but also German. And so they were recognizing what the Germans were speaking, but the Austrians had no chance to recognize what the not Germans were speaking, and that created the feeling of being a threat for quite a long time. And it's still present today, I would say, on several ways. of course, with the National Socialistic time that strengthened all the feelings, in fact. That's the part dealing with borders and borderlines in Europe, and especially in Austria. We picked several places, border regions in Austria, where there's a discussion about borders. So that's the Styrian border, Spielfeld to Slovenia. And here you can see the actual discussions about refugees. In two different times, 1991 and 2015, and the Austrian army at the borders to Slovenia over here. And also the newsreels over here, creating, especially in the second one, creating the feeling of an enemy coming from the south. And the whole display here is, of course, as you can see, displays created like border fences. And here you can see a discussion about refugees. So the refugees during the Hungarian uprising in 1956. This was the largest group of refugees that reached Austria. And they really were embraced, coming as friends, and they were helped for quite a long time. Of course, with in mind that they once will go back to Hungary. The second point was in 1989, the refugees from the German Democratic Republic reaching Austria. It's also interesting because here you can see policemen right on the border giving maps to the refugees, maps of Germany, how they can reach Germany quite fast. So not only driving through Austria. But in fact, they were also welcomed as friends, especially because they were speaking German. This part here we have Tyrol, Vienna, and southern Tyrol, of course, in the discussion. But it's also very actual regarding citizenship. That's a discussion about groups in society who are fighting for their rights and who are not recognized. It's a discussion about different languages in Austria, Gastarbeiter, for example. It's a discussion about religion. About women in society and so on. It's not very much objects here, but people who are telling their stories. So that's how the display is working here.
And you finish actually with the
It was an interesting development. Austrian newspapers were really fighting against the dress, against it. Saying that he's not a man, not a woman, so what has he or she done to be part of an Austrian exhibition? Of course, it was against homosexuals, the whole discussion. It was interesting because people reacted to that. The third day after our opening, people were running into the museum, getting photos from the dress, running out, being really, really angry, saying that's why do you put a dress like this? Why do you include the story, giving him or her a platform? So that was an interesting discussion. Just an explanation here. Here we have the level that is dealing with the balcony, in fact. So where Adolf Hitler announced the Anschluss in 1938. And here we have several exhibitions that are changing, of course. And all the exhibitions have to do with the Shoah, because there we have the discussion with the balcony. We started with an exhibition about Alma Rosé, a violin player that died in Auschwitz. So that's we use her name, Alma Rosé, to name the plateau here. It's called the Alma Rosé level. And since 2 weeks we have this exhibition here about the extermination camp Mali Trostenets in Belarus as a specific point of the Shoah where Austrians were involved in that as perpetrators, but 10,000 of Austrians also died in Mali Trostenets. So here we have the whole discussion about the extermination planning of the Germans, and Austrians also included with Adolf Eichmann, for example, and how the whole extermination process worked until the end of war. So that's something we have here, with a large section of international remembrance. So the remembrance about Mali Trostenets in Austria, in Germany, and in Belarus, and at the place itself by the population. So, and just also to compare a little bit how different nations are commemorating, and especially how probably a collective commemoration could work in a European commemoration. It's a good example because between Germany, Austria, and Belarus, it's not that easy, having other focuses. Yeah.
When you say 10,000 Austrians, you mean mostly Jewish?
Only Jewish.
Only Jewish.
So
they were Austrian citizens.
Yeah, they were taken out of the flats and houses in Austria, sent to Vienna inside some collections camps within the city.
Which they are? Can you name some of them?
Yeah, for example, the Malzgasse. So it was that kind of was a former hospital, or they were also using schools to put several families into flats. For example, Malzgasse was one of his. Kastelletsgasse was the next one. Kleine Sperlgasse was the next one. And in 1942, all of the flats and the people were taken out of the flats and were sent to the east, to Minsk. And in fact, in 1942, 10 transports went from Vienna station, Asbahnhof station in Vienna, to Mali Trostenets directly, and were killed just after arriving there. And within every train every transport there were 1,000 Austrians, all of them Jews, and all of them were killed. Only 22 survived Mali Trostenets, so that's just to have a comparison about the numbers. And it's a strong point, of course, because Austria officially remembers those victims since this year. So that's the memorial built by Austria, the Austrian government, in Mali Trostenets in March 2019.
And exists any big memorial in Austria?
No.
And is any initiative to have such a memorial?
There are private initiatives. For example, it's a group called IMA by Waltraud Paton. Her family died in Mali Trostenets. Family members died in Mali Trostenets. That's a private initiative where several victims' families were coming together and just to commemorate. But there are also groups, of course, also official groups. There are researchers. So my colleague Birgit Johle is creating an exhibition about the Malzgasse. So this very one camp in Vienna, and the transport going out from there. So there is something. Of course, at the places with the collection camps, there are memorials and memorial stones, of course, but there is no central memorial in Austria about that. There is a Jewish memorial of the victims of the Shoah, but it's still a discussion. It's also a discussion about a museum of the Holocaust, because Vienna and Austria does not have a museum of the Holocaust still. So, but here it's kind of what we are trying to do is to have a starting point and saying, okay, we will try to initiate something like that on one of the prominent and famous places in Vienna, because when you look, it's still closed. It's not possible to go outside because of several reasons. because the balcony is a little bit dangerous. But what you can see here is the view you have. You can see over the Heldenplatz, and you can see all the institutions of democracy in Austria. So you can see the Hofburg, where the Austrian president is. You can see the Ballhausplatz, where the chancellor is. You can see the parliaments. You can see the house of the mayor, and so on. But in fact, especially you can see the Heldenplatz, where 200,000 people were cheering in 1938. And when talking about victims myth and the problematic past of Austria, this balcony is really in the center, because Austria was not able to deal with the balcony since 1945. The balcony was never used again for anything. It's called, so we as a historian, I would say that's one of the most interesting places in Austria, because here you can see what a problematic past was creating, in fact. A place where you are not able to step outside. Just to give you an example, in 1955, when the Austrian State Treaty was finished, it was a discussion which balcony the Austrian government should use to present the State Treaty to the population, to the public. The first thing was, and the first plan was to use this balcony. But then all the government members were saying, that's not a good idea, because then you have a comparison to 1938. It would be problematic if there were less than 200,000 people at the Heldenplatz. So we probably should leave this balcony alone and go to the next balcony at the Belvedere. And that's how Austria is dealing with this party. I think that's quite typical.